Hi everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on the latest trends in attracting, motivating and retaining employees. I'm Joyce from Prime and I'll be your moderator today. Just a few housekeeping notes. This session will run between 45 to 60 minutes. Feel free to drop your questions in the chat. We'll try to address them at the end of the session. And also just a reminder that this webinar is being recorded. So today we're joined by two fantastic speakers, Jamie Paterson, Head of Workplace Strategy of the Southern Region at Mapien, and John Day, Partner of Remuneration Services at Prime Financial Group.
Thank you, Joyce.
I'm sure we all agree that attracting, retaining talent is one of the biggest challenges for businesses today. Increased competition, flexible working, and changing employee expectations mean that traditional compensation strategies are no longer enough. So today we'll be looking at some key challenges businesses are facing and explore how employee equity plans can assist, including the latest trends in design and the importance of communicating the value to employees. And we'll close the session with Q&A. I'll now hand over to Jamie, who will start with the key issues businesses are facing today. Thanks, Jamie.
Thanks, Joyce. Good morning, everybody. So over the past 5 years or so, we've seen a lot of significant changes in employment generally, in the employment and the workplace. And this has had a flow-on effect into employers and employees generally. And it's had an impact on the way that people are viewing the workplace. From a legislative perspective, we've got the Closing the Loophole Bills acts there that introduced changes to casual employment and gave more powers to casual employees and more benefits to them in relation to seeking alternative employment other than casual, so part-time and full-time. We saw the acts bring in measures that define and support employee-like workers, so gig workers as an example. We saw the powers of the Fair Work Commission can now consider applications related to labour hire workers. We've seen increased discrimination laws, and we've seen introduced general protections and or rights for union delegates. We've had a new Fair Work Ombudsman came in the last few years. They're there to oversee compliance and provide an education service on employment. And when she came in, I've got a quote from her here. She said, "I'm dedicated to upholding the rights of workers and ensuring that businesses comply with workplace laws. My focus will be on education support and enforcement to create a fairer work environment for Australians." So very much a push to make sure that the workplace is a fairer place for employees. The protecting worker entitlements brought in greater protections for migrant workers, updated parental leave provisions, and included the insertion of superannuation into the national employment standards now. So that's increased that as well. The Secure Jobs Better Pay legislation provides new rules for job security, for pay transparency and flexible work arrangements as well, and generally strengthens the gender equity measures that are out in employment. We've seen paid family and domestic violence leave come into play. That's changed from 5 days to 10 days. So again, an increase for employees there. And we've seen a lot of movement in the areas of respect at work and impacts or outcomes that can be levelled at employers when it comes to sexual harassment. Also allows the Fair Work Commission to get involved in cases of sexual harassment and issue stop sexual harassment orders. So what we've seen generally there is, a push back to pushing legislation back to employee-friendly and union-friendly legislation. Look, in my view, a lot of it is well overdue, particularly around the sexual harassment, doing a lot of workplace investigations. I get to see the impact of that. So, the stronger we can go from a legislative perspective on things like that, and discrimination and family domestic violence, is a good thing, I think. But generally speaking, there's also industry thinks that a lot of these provisions have potentially gone well to the left in supporting employees and unions. The right to disconnect is one of those that came in. I was at the AFR Workplace Summit when that got announced. It was brought in and allows employees to refuse contact outside of working hours unless that contact is reasonable. It essentially means employees can choose not to monitor or not to respond to contact or attempts to contact them outside of working hours. There was, as I said, I was at the the AFR Workplace Summit when that came through, so an industry body and represented by industries large and small, and they were up in arms about this because it was brought in with little to no consultation with industry. The ALP brought it in because they needed to do a deal with the Greens at the time, and that's what the Greens wanted. So, but with the way we've seen it played out, it's not that bad at all. There are ways that organisations can work around it, and it doesn't necessarily mean you can't talk to your employees outside of hours. There's just a few things you need to consider within there. That's come into play for large organisations and will come into play for small organisations August this year. We've seen pay secrecy, so new legislation prohibits pay secrecy clauses in contracts of employment. This means that employees now have the right to share or not share the terms and conditions of their employment with other employees, and there can be no ramifications back on them from that. So employers are now prohibited from December 2022 from including any pay secrecy clauses in contracts of employment. We've seen increases in the enterprise bargaining side of things, or changes to the enterprise bargaining processes. It makes it easier for individual bargaining representatives to force their employer to the table in certain circumstances. We've seen multi-employer bargaining has been an issue and has been something that a lot of employees have been dragged into. And we've seen increased rights to union delegates as well. And of course, COVID's in there. So COVID and the rise of work from home has been an issue that change that has come into the workplace over the last 5 years. And we've seen a lot of organisations struggling with people working from home, trying to get people back into the office, etc. So what's this? This has had an impact on employees and employers. Look, there's an ageing workforce. That's quite widely understood. This means that people are going to be leaving the workforce, which is good opportunities for people that are coming up under them, but it's also lost skills and lost experience that organisations are going to experience. And so there's challenges there with regards to getting the next generation ready for stepping up. Increased competition is always out there, and that always has an impact on your employees. They're always, if anyone's on LinkedIn, which I'm sure most of the people here are, you're always getting knock on the doors from recruitment agencies, etc. when you for different opportunities. We've seen changing employee expectations, specifically around flexible work and work from home. Anyone who's done any form of recruitment lately will probably contest to the fact that one of the questions you always get is, what's your policy with regards to work from home? What's your policy with regards to office attendance? Okay, so there's definitely expectations there from people that they want to work from home, and that should be part of the job. Proving to be very problematic. We've dealt with a client recently who it was an acquisition, and the company that they acquired, they said, we're going to take all the employees over, we're going to acknowledge their start dates and benefits, etc. And then post the go live date, there was a push to get them into the office, but what they discovered is that over the last couple of years, People have been allowed to work from home 100% of the time. In some cases, people have been allowed to work from interstate, and in one case from international. So because people had been allowed to do that, that really became an expectation that they should be able to continue with that. It also became an argument that because they've done the job, they've been paid, and it's been totally acceptable for a period of time. It's almost a contractual right. So very, very problematic, and we'll see that, no doubt. We've seen a push for reduced work time. In enterprise agreements, we've seen a push from the unions for what they're calling 100, which is pay is at 100%, work is at 80%, so 4 days a week, and with the expectation that the employee will produce 100% of their productivity. So something that's hotly debated, and obviously companies don't necessarily support it for a lot of jobs. Some jobs they're trialling it, etc. So we've seen an increase in the 4-day week, push for 4-day week, push for a 9-day fortnight, etc. So generally a push for reduced work time. And of course, we've seen increased turnover. It started with, at the end of COVID, we had the Great Resignation, they called it. But again, all these things, ageing workforce, increased competition, etc., is providing an increased turnover. So what does this cost your organisations? Let's start with the financial side of things. So the cost of replacing an employee in Australia can range from 50 to 150% of their annual salary. The average cost of turnover per employee is approximately $50,000, considering recruitment, onboarding, and lost productivity. When it comes to the productivity costs, you've got higher performers up to 400% more productive than average employees. So losing these employees can significantly impact your organisation. It can significantly impact the productivity of your organisation and of your teams. And it takes an average of 42 days to fill a vacant position in Australia, during which time the projects may stall and teams can lose momentum. The 42 days, I think, is generous. I think it's usually longer, personally, given that most people need to give 4 weeks or 20 days notice. So you've got to have that on the clock to start with before you can get anyone on board. We talk about the financial cost, and we talk about the productivity costs. And one of the things that organisations don't often consider is the psychological cost, which is really important. The increased focus on psychosocial hazards in the workplace, which is a completely separate webinar on itself, is definitely being experienced by employers, and something that they really need to consider under legislation at the state level and at the federal level. Sitting within the OH&S side of things, there's a lot of obligations on employers to ensure that those psychosocial hazards are being considered. So when you look at the psychological costs of turnover, you need to consider things like stress and burnout of remaining employees, the increased workload. A lot of organisations just get more people or more, the same amount of work being done by less people. We've seen lost cohesion across teams, poor workplace relationships. Our organisational psychologists always talk about teams. They talk about forming, storming, norming, and performing. You lose people, you're back to forming. So very important to consider that. And of course, that all equates to lost productivity. There's a couple of references there on the bottom for where I got my stats. So with the changes that we've seen in employment and the impact it has on employees and employers, that has increased the focus on employee turnover. We have organisations come to us and say, we need you to help us with our EVP, our employee value proposition. And that could be anything from competitive wages and superannuation, assistance with health cover, gym membership, purchase additional leave, all these things bundled together to essentially give people the reason to stay with the organisation or the reason to come to your organisation. One of the things, which is what you're all here for today, is employee share plans, which is something that can also form part of that employee value proposition. So to talk about that, I'm going to hand over to John Day.
Thank you, Jamie.
Sure.
There's no doubt that employee participation plans are the biggest way to retain staff statistically. The information from this can come from a couple of sources. The first slide we have is based on the Australian Employee Ownership Association's website. That association is dedicated to employee ownership, and just some of the benefits you'll see on that website. And by the way, please look up that website for your own information. There's a lot of data, a lot of statistics, a lot of information on the benefits of employee participation plans, equity plans. But certainly, employee equity plans increase shareholder value, employees' wealth. That's the whole concept, sharing the wealth between the employer and the employee. That's the whole, one of the main reasons for an employee share plan. It's certainly, as I said before, is a retention strategy, but also part of recruitment. It's an expectation today that employees expect to be participating in some form of equity plan. It also motivates, clearly, if you can align the objectives of the directors, which is based on the objectives of the directors, with the employees, clearly the organisation is going to be a lot more successful. It will lead to lower salaries being paid because people are more look at motivating through increased return on their equity investment or short-term incentives. It's on the website. I'm not sure about this one, but it's obviously a stat that the AEA has, that it actually requires less supervision for staff. Job satisfaction, definitely. And when it comes to succession planning, which is paramount for particularly unlisted companies nowadays, given the demographic of most unlisted company owners, there's no question that an employee ownership plan will A, make the business more saleable quicker, but B, make it worth more to sell. So to go back to what Jamie said, employee equity is an expectation, and this is a quote: businesses that have employee equity incentives last longer, pay higher salaries, make greater profits. And to support that, I thought I'd do a little bit of digging around to get some stats. This is from two places. One's the National Centre for Employee Ownership in the USA, and one from a study done in the UK by Professor Nuttall. And these stats are supported by Australian stats as well. Employee equity companies are 25% more likely to survive. They last longer. Productivity amongst all employees increases by 8 to 12%. Sales grow by more than 8.8% per employee. As I said before, the companies last longer, make more money, they grow quicker. And as I said before, they pay higher wages, 5 to 12% more wages. To set the scene about remuneration and where do employee equity plans fit in, obviously good remuneration practices, you've got to pay good base pay. Base pay is really about come to work money. What does your competitor pay? What will your competitor pay for that same job, doing the same work, same hours? Good remuneration diet is to have what's called short-term incentive, commonly cash bonuses, commissions, and perhaps some equity plans. And then today's focus is going to be a long-term incentive. Just while I've got that STI up there, the short-term incentive, one of the things we do notice in designing a good STI is to make the payment for the bonus or the commission out of the margin dollar, that is the profit dollar where possible, not off revenue. Because the motivation for an STI where it's based on a revenue target is that they'll go for revenue at the expense of profit or margin. So that's one of our common things we find, is to make sure the STI is at a margin dollar. Yes. When it comes to LTIs, there's two questions people often ask me, particularly for unlisted companies. One's not up there, is that how do I value my business? And that's a very important part. And we at Prime can help with that, with our expertise in valuing companies. It is the most common question we get when we're helping design an LTI for a client. The second question we get is what percent, because people always say, what do other people do? And I say, that's fine, we should do what's best for you, but just so you know what other people are doing, this is sort of the average of the STI allocation and LTI long-term incentive, STI short-term incentive, allocation based on the roles and responsibilities. And clearly, the higher the responsibility, the higher the level of responsibility work, typically the STI allocation, LTI allocation is larger. And even there's another line I could have called boards of directors. We're doing a report recently where the board of directors decided, or the shareholder decided they want the board to have an LTI, and so we do some stats on what's typically the percent of fixed remuneration. These are 8% of base pay, fixed remuneration. Thanks, Joyce. So, what type of equity? What suits what organisations? There's four main types of equity. One's called options. Options typically have a strike price. The strike price is normally set at the value the shares are at the day they're offered. For a listed public company, that's easy because it's on the ASX. For an unlisted company, as I said before, we need to get the valuation done by a qualified valuer for that purpose. The second one, which is more popular nowadays, is a performance right. Now, performance right basically is an option without a strike price. You can exercise a performance right without having to pay the strike price. It used to be called a ZEPO, zero priced option, but performance right is probably the most common form of equity being offered nowadays for both listed and unlisted companies. Clearly, when it comes to succession planning, normally speaking, for an unlisted company, we offer shares to employees because shares actually align completely with the owner's objectives. Although, of course, you can have a performance rights plan that can be exercised in the shares once those objectives have been achieved. And then we have shares with a loan. Probably in most areas of advice we find, in Australia anyway, you find a lot of loan plans because though we try and make the area as understandable as possible, the Australian Taxation Act and all the corporate requirements are quite difficult. So people just generally go straight to a loan plan, which loan plan's a bit like an option plan. You've got to pay the value of the day you've been granted the loan. There are some issues with loan plans which accountants listening will understand, called otherwise deductible rule and division 7A, but I won't dwell on that now. Thank you. So when should we use each of these? Options are really good for a company which is first starting off. It's an option to achieve a certain objective. There is legislation called startup provisions in the ATO Income and Taxation Act, which is very beneficial for startups. But definitely where a client says to us, and this is what we do, we always say, what are the objectives of the directors, of the shareholders? Do they want to keep their business? Do they want to sell their business? And if they say to us, well, we really want to have an event, we want to have an event which is either an IPO, a public listing, or a trade sale, typically we would recommend an option, which is only exercisable, the only vesting condition of the option is when there's going to be that event. Simple, there's no shares transfer, there's no need to go to ASIC and do a 484 share lodgement. Very simple. Another motivation for a lot of unlisted employer directors is an option you cannot receive a dividend. So it's where the directors wish the employees or particulars not to have a dividend, they would typically do an option for that purpose. And if it is that the employee is to be retained, part of succession planning, well then obviously to acquire the share they need to pay the exercise price. Performance rights I've mentioned previously are probably the most common. Again, it doesn't require the issuing of shares to the share register. It's based on an event occurring typically, which can be just stay there for 3 years, but sometimes that doesn't align with where there's external shareholders. So with performance right, you typically, you may have a price to pay for it, but before that performance right can be exercised, the directors will decide what other performances really require, and we're going to touch on that in a moment. And some of the more common performances, particularly for a listed public company, what's called total share return, TSR, EBITDA, which is basically a net profit calculation, or share price increase. In other words, employee equity plans are about aligning the interests of the external shareholders, the foundation shareholders, the people who put the money up, with the internal shareholders, the most important internal shareholders being the employees and other contractors and participants in the plan. It's where a performance right, you don't wish the employee to pay for it, but again, a performance right is unable to earn a dividend. So if the directors do not want the employees to earn a dividend until they exercise into the equity, they would typically choose a performance right. I mentioned shares. Shares are really good for a succession plan. I also mentioned before, like a performance right, they would normally require some performance condition. With a share, though, of course, not only does the employee participant share in the growth and the value of the share, but also they become entitled to a dividend. And we have a situation where directors or the owners really just do not want to sell their business. They have no intention of having an IPO. They simply want the business to pass from generation to generation. Or then what motivates a external share or participant employee to become a shareholder? It's a dividend stream. And normally speaking, unlisted private companies have a much higher dividend payment per share than listed companies. So it's quite a good motivator. And if you think about it long enough, the employees really, they are the ones that benefit from this because they actually will be involved in increasing the shareholder value. And the more they can increase profits, the more they align with the objectives of the directors, the greater the profits will be and the greater the dividends they receive. So it is complete alignment with external shareholders. And I mentioned before, it's also part of a succession planning strategy. Thanks, Joyce. Talk about loan plans. Probably you see most of these designed by professional advisors around the country. They are simple to understand. A loan's made for the value of the share. Why do we do that? It's to avoid paying tax on the shares when they've been first lent. And the employee will participate in the growth in value at an event in the future. And at the same time, with a loan plan, employees can participate in the dividend stream. I will just, as said before, exercise caution there. Be aware, talk to your advisors about the loan plans. If operating well and within the framework of the law, fantastic, but we've got to watch this thing I mentioned before about Division 7A plans and otherwise deductible interest if you don't charge interest on the loan. But again, please talk to your accountants and advisors about that issue. Thanks, Joyce. So far we've talked about the types of equity. The next question we get, apart from how do you value the business, what type of equity, what are the metrics, what are the performance conditions you're seeking to achieve for the targets? And when a business is first starting off, they often don't have a profit. So what do you have as a target? What's the measurement? Well, obviously, to get a profit, you've got to have revenue, you've got to keep costs under control. So you may well, the first metric or first performance requirement for an equity might be increasing revenue from A to B or 1 to 2. Sometimes companies have a business plan where a target is to actually have losses for the next 3 to 4 years. And therefore, there's no point in having a profit metric because there's no plan to have a profit. So what we would do there is achieve a certain revenue and then have a loss no more than a certain amount. So if you can achieve that, the target's achieved. The directors have achieved their objectives. They're probably growing the business to get to a certain revenue, which might be of interest to an IPO or a trade sale, and therefore that's the target. And so don't make it any more complicated. There's no point putting a profit target on a business which is going to make a loss. And that's a little message in that. When you're ever designing these things, make sure whatever you're designing is achievable. The worst thing you can ever do is design a plan where it's just not achievable. And all that does is completely demotivate all the employees. And the only reason we do any of this is to motivate our staff, to retain them and to attract new employees. So anything we do has to be achievable. Otherwise, there's no point doing it. The next most common metric is what we call earnings before interest, tax, depreciation and amortization, EBITDA. EBITDA is very popular for both unlisted companies and unlisted companies and listed companies. It is a profit measurement. It's a profit measurement, but it takes out what we call the non-cash expenses, and therefore it's almost a proxy for cash flows. So it is popular because it's meant to be. Most companies will have a target which is based on maybe a revenue target matched with an EBITDA target. No point having a revenue target without a profit target. And the most common one amongst listed and unlisted companies is EBITDA. The next one, which is also probably not that much different, but not as much a proxy for cash flow, is net profit after tax. But again, it's easily understood and therefore a good metric for a company. Thanks, Joyce. What I do like, whether it's a listed company or an unlisted company, is the share price increase. I mean, as remuneration consultants, our goal is to achieve the objectives of the directors. The directors have an objective to increase shareholder wealth. There is no more simple measurement of shareholder wealth than share price increase. Again, for a private company, you'll need to get it valued. For a listed company, it's easy because it's on the ASX. So wherever possible, I would encourage, when I'm talking to clients, and remember all clients are different, but quite often we'll use this as a very simple measure to achieve shareholder wealth. Earnings per share is another one, also very popular. Basically, it's what the profit is per share. It can be an indicator of dividend, and that's another one. Dividend flow could be another one, but earnings per share is a simple measurement, easily understood, easily compared from company to company, and a great way to measure the performance of a company. Next one, please, Joyce. This one here, TSR. Now, you probably won't find TSR so much in unlisted companies, but you may. In listed companies, what a lot of listed companies do, they say, well, what's my competitors? What are they using? And they say, well, they're using TSR. Fine. TSR is great if the company's paying a dividend, but there's no point using TSR if you're not paying a dividend, because the TSR is called total shareholder return, and it's a combination of share price increase plus dividends. You'd be amazed how many companies I come across that have TSR as a metric for their employee equity plan when the company has absolutely no intention of paying a dividend for the next 3 or 4 years. So it may well be that your competitors have TSR, but is it the right metric for your organisation? And that's a good question. Next one, Joyce. Now, all that's a bit of tax and a bit of accounting and a bit of measurement, and we can talk about employee share plans all day, but and we can spend hours and hours and fees with lawyers and accountants getting the documentation correct, and that's all very important. But the most important part of any employee equity plan is communication, which I'll pass over to Jamie.
Thanks, John. Yeah, he's absolutely right there. These things will not succeed if you don't communicate it properly across your workforce. The key example I use, working with a large mining company recently, and they gave out shares to employees as an incentive. And what the employees were required to do is then log in and register and accept those shares. They came to me because they weren't getting the uptake in a certain mine site, and when I looked into it, they were underground miners, so they weren't reading their communications. They didn't get on the computers very often at all, so they didn't have the opportunity to register and accept the shares. And the other thing that they did is that some of those that did read it sent out the messages amongst themselves that if I take these shares, I'm going to get hit with more tax and I'm going to be worse off overall. What the company didn't do in that instance is they didn't own the communications, and they didn't tailor those communications. Working through this slide here, I think it's key to simplify the message by using clear language and provide easy to understand examples. The analogy I always give organisations is pretend I'm a 15-year-old on a school excursion, and explain it to me. And that way it really sort of brings it to a level that majority of people will understand. Highlight the benefits, explain the financial gains and tax advantages. In that instance that I talked about, we got a financial advisor in to address each of the crews and say this is what it means. Couldn't give tax advice, obviously, because it will have an impact on their tax, but generally speaking, most people would have more money in their pocket. So that highlighted, gave us the opportunity to really highlight those benefits. Engage through multiple channels, don't rely on the one. Again, in that case, most of those employees do not log on. They were underground working throughout their shift and didn't see the communication. So use multiple channels, webinars, face-to-face meetings, toolbox meetings, all the like, and provide FAQs for your employees and an ongoing FAQ as well. So as questions come in, provide people the opportunity to ask questions confidentially, and maybe even anonymously. A lot of people won't put their hand up in a group and ask the question for fear of being judged. So, provide that FAQ and don't be afraid to have that as a rolling FAQ with new questions. Tailor the communication and, use the means that you normally use to communicate with your employees. If you're large enough and you have an intranet, then use that. If you communicate over WhatsApp, then use that, because it's what your employees are used to, and that's the best way to get the message across. Showcase those success stories, share the testimonials, give examples of what it would mean to Fred if he worked these hours, and etc. And sort of make a real life example there. Ensure that transparency, so clearly outline the plan terms, provide detailed information on vesting and what it means long term as well as short term for your employees, and encourage that participation. That's what I was asked to do in that case. They had about a 10% take up, and when we finished implementing a good communications plan and pushing it through the business and providing that financial advisor, we had well into the high 90s accept the shares, and they were on their way. So going back to John's point, incredibly important to the success of any plan that you communicated. You have a good communication plan and you communicate it well.
Okay.
Thanks, Jamie and John, for your insights. We are now open for any questions. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to drop it in the chat box. Okay, so Jamie, I think there's a question that came through for you. So how do equity plans differ for EA covered and non-EA covered employees? Are there any common pitfalls employers should be aware of when structuring equity plans across both groups?
Yeah, good question. So in a lot of organisations that have an enterprise agreement, you're going to have enterprise EA covered employees and you're going to have non-EA covered employees. At the end of the day, your EVP, your employee value proposition, is aimed at attracting people in both of those groups. So by all means, offer it to EA covered people as well, simply because it attracts them and helps retain your business. And we went through why you want to do that. One of the key pitfalls that there is, be very, very careful in inserting the plan in any way into the enterprise agreement. When the EA gets renegotiated, if you're sitting there with any good bargaining representative, they'll have a look at anything across the business that infers a benefit to the employees, and they'll want that embedded in the enterprise agreement, and they'll push for that. And the advice is to, push back on that, hold the ground and say, look, we're still going to keep it as a benefit to the employees, but we're not going to include it in the enterprise agreement, because the reason for that is that most of these plans, when you set them up, you want them to be discretionary, at the company's discretion. So if for whatever reason you need to pull back on those, COVID is a prime example. Organisations needed the flexibility to be able to pivot and change things like that in order to help survive. If it's embedded in the enterprise agreement, it's arguably incorporated by reference. It's arguably contractually binding for those employees, and you might find yourself in a position where you won't be able to change it. So you need that flexibility around it. So by all means, provide it to your EA covered employees because it helps attract and retain them, but keep it outside the enterprise agreement.
Thanks, Jamie. So I just want to say that if anyone has any questions, please add it in the Q&A section. Okay, let's see. John, can you share an example of a well-communicated equity plan? What's your experience been like?
It's interesting. Over the years, we've done a lot of work in the mining industry. It's interesting. I had another one. I sort of, that Joyce first said that, I thought of one, but then I related back to the mining.
Mm.
You know, employee equity plans are the ultimate form of respect. You know, you're showing respect to the employees by saying you're worthy to become a co-owner with us. And we all know that the best way to motivate any employee is to show respect before money, before flexible work hours. So part of that showing respect is the communication. And part of that, like the mining, I'll never forget it. We would spend a lot of time with this quite a large mining company, head office WA, with the lawyers and accountants, all important. Get all that ironed out, the documentation in place, get the communication in place, so you do some workshops to make sure it's understandable, because, you know, every company, every industry has a different communication language. So it's got to be written in the language, as you said before, James, it's got to be simple. There's got to be language to that entity. But the respect there was we would do seminars at 1 o'clock in the morning, 3 o'clock in the morning on site. So we're travelling all these mining companies. Staying, is it Dong? You're staying? Is it? You staying at Diamond? You felt that you were a fly in, fly out, but you're flying in, flying out, running seminar. But we spent hours with these people, and they'd probably never had that sort of effort made before, and they really embraced the plan, and they really got behind it. This particular plan, believe it or not, was a matching plan, which I did mention before, probably should have, where the employer would say, for every X amount of dollars we put in, every amount of dollars you put in as part of your remuneration, we will match it with the number of shares of performance rights. So it was, you know, it ticked all the boxes. It had the LTI, it had the contribution of the employees. But that plan went really well. And as much as I thought well designed, I think it's more the fact we made the effort and actually sat down and spoke to people and talked about it one-on-one. And then, like as Jamie said, it wasn't just that first initial thing. They had a process where you go back every 6 months or every 12 months to update them on what's going on. And that's critical, because what happens, employees leave, new employees come on, people forget. So it's also, if you go to the AO website, the one I mentioned previously, it's also there that it's one of the most important parts of a successful, but really, I suppose about anything in life is about communicating, isn't it? And showing respect.
Yeah.
Not much different.
Thanks, John. Okay, Jamie, I think this question might be for you, just around fairness. So the question is, how can a company navigate internal communication when the CEO decides not to offer the plan to all employees? So and that leads to concerns about fairness.
Yeah, okay, good question. Good question. Probably off the back of the EA question, I think the example that we had there, you know, in a lot of large organisations, you've got EA covered employees, wages employees, for want of a better term, outpaid by the hour, and then you've got staff employees who are paid on an annualised salary that probably has a contract that has should have a contract that has a cleverly written set-off clause that says that their annualised salary covers them for reasonable additional hours, overtime, you know, all that sort of stuff. Whereas the hourly employees don't have that. They work by the hour, they get paid by the hour. At the end of the day, there's two different types of employment in that situation. And the CEO and the company is well within their rights to provide benefits to both of those groups separately or combined. When you look at the unfairness of, let's say, staff employees getting access to a share plan and wages employees not, it comes back to the communication. It comes back to respectful communication, like John just said. You know, I would highlight some of the examples that come with being a wage employee or an hourly employee. For example, if hourly employees do work on a weekend, they get weekend penalties. If they do overtime, they get overtime. As a general rule, most of EA covered employees can leave their work at work. Staff employees, wages employees can't email their work home. Staff employees will often email their work home, and they'll be sitting at home on the weekend tapping away doing work. They don't get paid overtime for that. There's more responsibility in the staff area for a lot of people, a lot of positions. So I think it's just about identifying and communicating clearly and respectfully the differences between the two different types of employees, and just explain why you're providing it to these people and not providing it to the others.
John, Here's a question.
I haven't got too long.
No. So the question is, what happens to options issued to an employee if they resign from the company?
So, and it could be any equity. So that's all in how the plan's been designed. If the design is that the option is that they have to be there at a certain event, e.g. a monetisation event, a trade sale, and they resign before the option, before that event, then typically it lapses, it's the option cancels. We always recommend, whether you're a listed company or unlisted company, that the directors maintain discretion. So yes, normally they would miss out because they've left, because the whole thing about employee share plan is all working together as an objective. So there's not a lot of point rewarding people who don't achieve that objective. So therefore, normally you would say, no, that option lapses, therefore the person leaves, which is unfortunate because they were an integral part of the business. That's why they offered option in the first place. But there might be circumstances where there might be family illness or other bereavement family, or they have to move interstate and the employee's done everything correctly and they've moved 1 month or 1 year before the event, then the directors have discretion to say, yes, you can stay in the plan. It might even be a pro rata reduction compared to others. One of the things about employee share plans, in fact, any participation plan, it really is all the employees working together. So if you have a situation where one employee leaves because they're doing the wrong thing, then the other employees won't mind, and therefore the directors won't mind because they're missing out. But if someone does the right thing and, you know, all the other employees think they've done the right thing, then the directors probably might be a good idea to let them participate in the event. So we always like this director's discretion because you cannot always predict the future. You just don't know what's going to come around the corner.
COVID-19.
Yeah, you just don't know.
Thanks,
On that one there, that's why when you're doing documentation for these sorts of plans, like trustees or contracts, you've got to be flexible. You can't be too rigid.
Yeah.
Because you lock it, then you can go back again. So, yeah.
John, did you find organisations' remuneration plans like this are more successful if they focus on just one or two incentive elements, or do you get better outcomes by having more options?
In terms of the design of it, you think, or?
That's how I would interpret this question, yes.
So our thing is go back. First thing, what are the objectives of the directors? And it could be we want to float, we want to stay here forever. Then we always say to the directors or the owners, what are the 3 or 4 things you think are important to achieve that objective? And then what are the 3 or 4 things, hear me saying 3 or 4, not 20 or 15, 3 or 4 things that John could do, Jamie could do, Joyce could do to help achieve that objective. So we try and limit it to perhaps, depending on where they are in the business, it should be an objective on which they've got some control to have an outcome. There's no point in putting a target or an objective or a measurement on something where they have no control over it. It doesn't achieve anything. Therefore, it's got to be something they can manage and control. That's a fundamental. But I do like to limit it. We have come across where they've got 15 objectives, and you know, if the thing's hard to understand, it will not motivate. It will not, because they won't trust it. So any communication has to be understandable. I do the 15-year-old. I do another one that says you've got to be able to explain this in 5 minutes.
Mm.
It's got to be explained simply. If you can't explain in 5 minutes, it's too complicated. And I have a mantra: is keep things simple.
Yeah.
And the mantra is achieve directors' objectives, and then design the whole plan around that. I don't know if I've answered that question or not. Have I? Did I answer that question? Or did I get carried?
No, I think you did.
You're right.
Yeah. Jamie, what else are you seeing that is trending in regards to retaining employees that is not shares related?
Yeah, good question. We're seeing organisations look outside the box. Like I said before, it's not just about, the first thing they need to do is put competitive wages on the table. They don't need to be the highest. They don't need to be. They don't want to be the lowest. A lot of organisations need to put in some strategy around that. Where do you want to be in the market, and work to that. So that gives you competitive wages plus your superannuation. Bonuses are always good. So your REM package there is the foundation for your EVP. People are looking outside at different things like purchase additional leave. They're looking at additional personal leave as well. An organisation I'm working with at the moment provides employees during certain months to take 2 Fridays out of their annual leave, and they'll give them the other 2 Fridays. So essentially leave without pay, or additional days off, additional annual leave, if you like. Gym membership, the EAPs, psychological support for employees who are going through difficulties. Again, bringing you back to that psychosocial hazard focus that's coming into employment. There's a lot of obligations from an OH&S perspective for employers to help employees who are going through certain issues. So we're seeing them, provide support in that area through to basic things, fruit baskets, movie tickets, etc. So just my advice to organisations, because some of them come to us and say, we haven't got anything, we only pay people, wages and superannuation. It's like, well, okay, well, let's have a look what you actually have got and what you can do and what you can do that's not going to cost you much from a productivity or a cost perspective. So it's just about looking outside the box a little bit and having a think about what people might need. And it all depends on your demographic and the employment landscape you're in and the industry, etc.
John and Jamie. Okay, this is a good question. So the focus in our incentive structure examples have been purely financial, and they're wondering what place does demonstrating the right behaviours and values play in an incentive arrangement, and how this look when you want to drive the right behaviours and financial outcomes.
Can I have it?
You can go first.
You can correct me if I get it wrong. Our basic, we haven't got a lot of time to share everything, but unless an employee is a team player, they really shouldn't share in any of the team benefits. Now, a team player metrics aren't financial necessarily. They're about, training other people, customer satisfaction surveys. Look, go on. What else, Jamie? What else would you put in a non-financial basket?
Look, I think you're when it comes to the culture and the leadership of the organisation, that plays a big part. People are getting less and less interested in being tied to organisations that don't have good values, particularly younger generation. They will definitely push to understand what's your green initiatives. So that's going to be very important. When it comes to your employee surveys, engagement surveys, there's always one question that you should ask your employees, which is around the fact of would you recommend the company to your friends and family?
Nice.
And don't be afraid to share on your website, the outcome of your surveys, but also the movement of those surveys, so that people can see that this organisation is looking at and considering what their employees are going through and are experiencing, and they're doing something about it. So that's going to reflect on the leadership and the culture of the place.
So we say you've got to meet those minimum KPIs or KPRs before you can participate in any financial benefit. Because if you're not team play, you shouldn't participate in any of the bonus systems. So they can be things like occ health, safety. It can be retention of the employee. It can be all those things that are important to the directors. Those 3 or 4 things are important. But once you meet the team performance criteria, you then can participate in the financial benefits. We have found trying to put a financial dollar on a non-financial target, it doesn't work. It's messy. I had one client try and do it years ago, and I spent the whole year trying to work it out, and spent the next 12 months trying to measure it. So we always have very simple: keep the KPIs in place. And a lot of companies actually don't have KPIs. And you say, well, first you just start, what do you want your people to do and when? So get your KPIs right first, get your team play checked first. Once they achieve that, they then can participate in the in any financial metric.
Yeah. And I think just build your culture of
Culture's very
the
important.
behaviours of people. You know, the development of your leaders, your frontline leaders, is vital to your organisation. And again, we do a lot of workplace investigations, and probably well over 90% of them, there's a when I've done the investigation, there's a point in time in history that goes back at some point where if a leader had acted differently, we probably wouldn't be doing an investigation now. So, you know, teaching your leaders to have difficult conversations, to address issues and not let them fester, things like that will really improve your survey scores. And again, if you communicate that to your potential employees.
Good culture comes a lot from leadership, doesn't it?
100% does, yeah, definitely.
And we as advisors can't create culture. That's the leadership team and the foundation owners. But what we can do and out of the world is reward good culture. And there's no better way to reward good culture than an employee. That respect I talked about earlier, than to have an employee equity plan. We can't create culture, but we can reward culture.
Thanks, John. And Jamie, just conscious of time, but there's a great question, and I think we should talk through this. What are some common reasons employee equity plans fail, and how do we address them?
Look, the first example I give is communication, or not communicating it properly, not having a thought out communication plan that's specific to your business and to your people. That's the first thing that's going to make it fail. Beyond that,
I've got a couple
John,
of ones.
yeah.
Because that's a question that when you meet someone the first time, then they say, I want to have an employee share plan. You know, first, how do I value my business? Who gets what and when? And what can go wrong? So I find it quite a negative question, frankly, but that's what's in their mind. The first thing is to make sure to get all the financials right. There's no point having an incentive plan if it's not meeting the objectives of both the owners and the employees. So that's about the financial side. Make sure that the reward with its STI or an LTI is achieved. A reward that motivates staff. It's got to be motivational. Therefore, it's got to be a certain dollar value, shares or otherwise. But at the same time, it's got to return that to the owners. So that's the first thing, the financial analysis. Obviously, in our environment, where it's so litigious and you know, workplace work environment and all the taxation and corporations laws, we've got to make sure the documentation's in place. That's critical. But the thing that I've noticed, the biggest one was when an owner or a management team set this thing up, but they're actually not committed to it. And people aren't stupid, you know. If they know an owner's just walking the walk, but not just talking the talk, but not walking the walk, they pick up on it, and that's the biggest one that demotivates people. If they know that the owner's just sort of doing, or the director's doing it because the competitors are, then that's the biggest turn-off. Because if the employees see the senior management team not committed to it, well, what do you think the employees are going to do? You know, they're going to walk away. And also the main thing, communication and ongoing communication.
All right. Well, thanks, John and Jamie. And we're going to wrap this up now. Thanks, everyone, for your time today joining us. Feel free to contact John and Jamie if you have any further questions, or if there's anything else you'd like to chat to them directly. Here are their contact details on the slide. And thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Joyce.
Thanks, Joyce. Thanks, John.
Well done. Shake hands.
Thanks,